So today I'm going to talk about an environmental footprint of pork production at a national scale. Although actually I'm going to dig into kind of subnational environmental accounting for those of us in sustainability science, which is where I come to you, where I come from to you today. We're really actually going to be going finer and finer. For those of you who deal with hogs on a daily basis, I think the entire thing is going to look like a 50,000 foot level discussion. But in our discipline, we really are zeroing kind of down at a finer scale with what I'm going to show you today. I'm just going to start with an LCA. This was done by TOMA with the National Pork Board. And what it is it's a life cycle assessment. It's the kind of the greenhouse gases associated with a 4-ounce steak of pork meat. I guess you don't call it a steak, forgive me. In their work, they were looking overall for the entire U.S. and looking at where, if all the greenhouse gases were in one pie, where those greenhouse gases are occurring to produce that 4 ounces of pork meat. And so I just want to point out, starting here, that manure is the largest bucket, followed by, if you combine DDGs and corn feed, by the corn inputs into the hog production, and third, in-home consumption. So these are areas where the greenhouse gases are largest, and we can start to impact the total sustainable footprint of the meat. And we will be digging into largely the corn bucket, or I will in this presentation, and manure at the very end. Oh, look at that. Thank you. So here's a similar, only this is for water use. So probably not surprisingly, the amount of water that's embedded in that 4-ounce meat steak, largest is coming from the feed inputs, by and large. I mean, it just dominates. There is on-farm water use, that's the second bucket, but again, obviously it dominates. So when you look at that, the way that kind of my worldview of approaching these problems is let's take the perspective of the hog farmer. All right, so this is that center circle, which is the scope 1, which is who are you interested in and what control do they have? All right, so the hog farmer in scope 1 has control over their on-farm impacts. Now, from what I just showed you in those life cycle perspectives, the hog farmer actually isn't controlling much of that total life cycle greenhouse gases. Really, the manure is the largest kind of bucket that they can touch. But just so that I don't say things later that get confusing, let's stick with this hog farmer for a minute. All right, so that's their scope 1 emissions, everything that they own. When you look at the electricity, the natural gas, and any of the on-farm purchases of electricity and heating, cooling, then that becomes their scope 2 emissions when you're accounting for these greenhouse gases. And then everything else is scope 3. And through all of those scopes, we get to that lovely little pie. But in terms of kind of the perspective of certain players in the supply chain, right? What you own, what you control, scope 1, what you purchase for electricity, scope 2, everything else is scope 3. And that scope 3, the catch-all bucket, is really where my work plays into, because we look at supply chain sustainability. And so everything before the hog farmer, if that's our unit of analysis, the unit of analysis could be a pork producer, but we'll stick with the hog farmer. Everything before that is the upstream emissions. Again, these are all scope 3 emissions. That's where we get all of those on-farm impacts that we saw. So for water, all of those impacts, largest portion, are all happening upstream, not in control of the farmer, of the processor, of the retailer. They're all upstream. But you also have, in that scope 3 bucket, everything that's past scope 1, past that farmer. And so if you recall back to the greenhouse gases, for instance, you have in-home consumption, right? That's happening downstream, also not in control of the hog farmer in your kind of center unit of analysis. So with this, and kind of starting with this idea that the emissions are occurring and the water is occurring outside of what a farmer or a company or a retailer have control over, right? They're upstream in those Scope 3 emissions. My team and I set out to figure out, well, where are those emissions coming from for companies, meat and ethanol companies in the U.S.? And this largely means figuring out where corn is coming from, because again, if you recall, corn is the second largest bucket for greenhouse gases, and the predominant part of the feed, well, corn and soy then for the feed in the water use. And so we created a model called the Food Systems Supply Chain Sustainability Model, Foods Cubed, as I'll refer to it in the rest of this talk. And it traces sustainability impacts along the supply chain, because most farmers or producers of pork and other meats do not know where their corn's coming from, right? There are exceptions, some of the smaller cooperatives, but by and large, that visibility into those Scope 3 emissions, that visibility upstream in the supply chain doesn't exist with this commodity market that we use to feed our livestock in this country. So this model, uses all publicly available data. We start with corn production, which we all know where corn occurs in the U.S. It's in the upper right. And we move that corn to everywhere it's demanded. That includes hogs, but it also includes exports and ethanol and other meats and dairy, like the entire gamut, all right? In order to have that supply and demand connected, we use a least cost optimization model. So we assume that all demand for corn is solved simultaneously. When we run that through existing transport lines, so it's forced to go on roads or barge or rail to mimic, cost in that instance, we then are able to solve simultaneously for all of that demand of corn. To do this, we have to use data that only comes out every 5 years. So everything I'm going to talk about is going to be 2012. Just keep that in mind. We do have it for 2007, and come February, hopefully the USD will publish the 2017 data, but this is only 2012. So we've moved the corn to where it's demanded. We then take some of it to ethanol and move from there, turn some of it into DDGs, and then move those to the animals as well. So we're thinking of corn embedded in these animals both directly and via DDGs. We then move these animals to their primary processing facilities. So these dots that you can see are actually beef, pork, broiler, and ethanol processing facilities in the U.S. Again, all publicly available data. Just don't want anyone freaking out in the room. Behind those bushels of corn that we have in the model, we have carbon and water numbers. So typically, the scientific community working on environmental assessments will use one number for the carbon impact of a bushel of corn. What our team did was take that and provide as much spatial down to the county level detail as possible, really focusing in on the nitrogen application rate and the nitrogen application type to give us a spatially explicit carbon number. That's the orange, and that's actually 2007 and 12 on the upper. And then water use is just total irrigated water use in those 2 years that's going to corn. So then we have this at the county level. It's also, you see variation here also because it's by bushel, and we have some places where we're more efficient at growing corn than others. And so that's really where that variation is coming from, is the bushels and the nitrogen fertilizer and application rates. So then we move everything. Like I mentioned, the model does the least cost optimization. There's no market power. There's no time step. It's just everyone gets all their corn that they need for the year at once. The green lines are connecting counties where corn is produced to then the animal farm. In this case, this is just the pork industry. So, and then the pink lines are pork movement. The lines are not indicative of the actual path or even quantity. So while the pink ones that look pretty far are pretty obvious out in California, on average, the hogs are moving smaller distances, under 250 miles, much more reasonable with where the literature stands. But just for visualization, this is kind of how the model's running. And again, behind this, we have carbon and water. So here, we can see the total carbon impact of the U.S. pork industry. Those are the counties where the corn is coming from or where the DDG corn is coming from. And then in the bottom, where water use for the pork industry in the United States is coming from. I'm going to take a sidestep and give you a peek into some upcoming work. We're moving beyond just water use, right? Irrigation matters, but irrigation matters more where water is scarce. And so these black dots, different team, different colors, sorry. These black dots are, again, the pork processing facilities. But here we have sources of corn that's irrigated and the degree to which it's coming from water-scarce regions. So those red circles are areas where you have chronic water shortage in the United States every year, over and over. The areas in orange are dry, let me get this right. Yeah, the areas in orange are seasonal. So every year you have a dry period. Less of a risk than chronic water shortage, but still you're affected by water shortage. And then the yellow is corn coming from dry years. So these are areas that are habitually having drought years, but it's not annually. We've then connected the same way with the other stuff, these processing facilities to these areas of corn to get a sense of that supply chain impact. So let's go back to carbon and water use. I showed you the whole pork industry, but with this model, we're able to zero in on one company. And we aren't able to get down to the hog level. I mean, we're aggregating all of the hogs up to the county level and all of the corn up to the county level. So we're not getting to the on-farm. Like I said, for some of you, that's going to seem still really high. But the fact that we can get these impacts down to the county level is actually fairly new in our discipline. And so here we can sum it up through a company. So this is what our model predicts for Smithfield, their carbon and their water impacts. The areas of high carbon intensity are in those darker colors of orange and high water in the darker colors of blue. And as you can see, you don't always have areas that are high carbon and high water. They don't correlate necessarily. In fact, sometimes they can go the opposite. And so if Craig was here and we were talking about what he wants to impact, if he wants to impact carbon, Missouri and some of the Dakotas, water, it's really over in Nebraska and Kansas, which also will affect carbon, but not necessarily exclusively where he should focus for carbon. He's seen this, by the way, so he's well aware of this. And then you can look across, not just at one company, but across companies. So we have Smithfield again here on your left. And then on your right, at the top, we have Hormel and then Tyson, just the pork operations. And so from a company perspective, when trying to think about the strategies that they may employ for sustainability, decreasing their carbon emissions, where they might want to focus on farm efforts or ag retailers that they want to connect with is going to vary based on those upstream supply chain connections. And so, Tyson may go talk to ag retailers working in Michigan, but Hormel has no corn from Michigan coming into their supply chain, again, based on our model. We can then take this spatially explicit model that we've got, put it back into that big picture life cycle assessment that's already been done by the Pork Board and researchers, and provide some spatial details not only into the DDGs and corn feed, which I've shown you here, but actually we can bring in some spatial details into two other buckets of this life cycle assessment, the manure, and get county level manure environmental data, as well as in electricity and processing. So for the manure part, looking at both what type of manure management practices are occurring in the county. It has a big impact on your total carbon, but also the temperature also has an impact. And then electricity and processing, while it's not a big chunk, is relatively easy to spatialize simply because you can use average grid fuel types. So if you're using a lot of coal or if you've got a lot of wind like we do on the system, those affects how much greenhouse gases are coming from the processing plants, and so how much of their electricity use they're using. So you can put that in and then give a picture of the entire pork industry. We have on the bottom line the larger producers over on your right, with the smallest on your left. And this is not per 4 ounce steak, it's per hog, but you could, just numerically change that. The key here is that you see that we've got some hog producers that are on the lower end, around 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per hog, to as high as over 800. So you have a high variability in that range. The big producers over on the left, your right, sorry, are kind of hitting the averages, right? They're getting corn from a variety of the U.S., right? They're getting manure from, or hogs associated with the manure from a variety of places in the U.S., and so those total carbon impacts are averaging out, and they're kind of hitting the high end of the average in this case. However, some of these smaller producers over on your left, right, they're situated with one processing facility, and so they're stuck, if you will. They're path dependent based on where they have located themselves. So in terms of where their starting greenhouse gas emissions are going to vary. And so as we as a society or we as an industry want to start to make sustainability challenges, it's important to remember that it's not an even playing field to begin with. That some of this playing field is embedded simply in the infrastructure system which has been set up in the U.S.